week on It Happened to Me, a story of blackmail, corruption and revenge, which saw an innocent man being sent to death row.
When the judge actually gave the verdict and said, "You're sentenced to death," everything just turned off on me. I just collapsed.
Hello and welcome to It Happened to Me. Now, many of us have dreamt of starting a new life, maybe by emigrating and beginning all over again. Well, taxi driver Suny Wilson did just that and left Dover to live in the Philippines. But his dream nearly cost him his life when he fell in love with the wife of a notorious gangster.
Wherefore, accused Albert Ernest Wilson, alias Suny, alias Cano, is hereby sentenced to death. The
I'd just taken redundancy from the Harbour Board and really hadn't made up my mind what to do when a friend invited me out to the Philippines. So I said yes. We went out there. It was different. It was somewhere I hadn't been before. And when he pushed me to go back again, I decided why not, and went back to have another look. Vicky, she's just a very special person. She's so loyal, so loving. She's what we would call an old-fashioned English woman. She really is. All the old virtues that men love about a woman, she's got them all. She just grew on me and grew on me until we were in love and we got together. I found out that Vicky got a couple of children, and at that stage Nika must have been about 10 and JR about 12. We decided that in 1994 we'd buy a lot and we'd put a house on it and make it 2 apartments for the children. As we were building the house, money became tight and Nika became more and more difficult. Teenagers go through periods of life. I didn't expect it to get beyond a lot of hassle while we were building it, and we could resolve it afterwards, so I tended to push it aside. But she started coming home with presents from her father, with money in her pocket, which was more than I'd got in my own, and it just became an impossible situation. I couldn't control her, I couldn't get her to come home at a reasonable hour, anything. I found out something else about the Philippines. Vicky couldn't get a divorce because there's no divorce in the Philippines. And her husband, well, when I went up to talk to him and say hello, he put a gun to my head. To Vicky's husband, Pio Pasco, she was just a possession. She was an old pair of shoes he'd thrown aside but still belonged to him. And he was just so jealous in a strange way. He didn't want her, yet he didn't want me to have her. And he did everything to get money from us, to throw us out of town. His family had got power in the local town. He was a drug dealer. He'd got a couple of other women, 6 other kids. He got himself in with the local police. So it's like his family were the bosses of the area, and we'd gone up against a gang almost.
Pio Pasco's threats were taking their toll on Suny's paradise life. But having got nowhere with attempts to extort money through violence, Pasco changed tack. He persuaded his daughter Nika to trump up a charge of attempted rape.
Nika came to the house and she said to her mum and her brother that she wasn't a virgin anymore and it was my fault. Needless to say, they were all very, very upset, very angry with me, and started shouting and screaming. JR grabbed a knife and he wanted to actually assault me. So little by little the situation was calmed down, and the neighbours, Vicky, JR, myself, we started asking questions. First off, it was this room, which she couldn't tell us where this room was. It was on the way back from the market, but of course we hadn't been to the market that day, she'd been to school. So it was a question of when, where and how. Next morning, Vicky's mum said, "It's all over, it's finished. Don't worry about it," which I couldn't understand. You know, Vicky's sister was there and said, "No, we spoke with Nika last night and it's not your problem, it's a family problem. Nika is just saying it because she wants you and her mum parted."
But that wasn't the end. 2 months later, Nika repeated the story to police, who arrested Suny and Vicky and charged them with attempted rape.
They took us to the police station and they put me into a cage. You can't describe it as anything else but a cage. It was about 4 foot by 4 foot, and there were always 3 people in it. And they handcuffed Vicky to the outside. If you get arrested by the police, you'd expect some sort of explanation, some sort of talking to you. But they weren't giving me anything. Vicky was shouting and arguing with them, and I had seen that Nika and Pio, her father, had been brought up the stairs, but they'd been taken into another room. So, obviously it involved them. The next thing I know, they're now telling me it's a rape charge instead of attempted rape, and there's no bail permitted. Somewhere close to 2 days, they kept me in a 4x4 cage in the police station, which was obviously very hard. But afterwards, they transferred me to a jail, the city jail. It was like a concrete coffin. When Pio Pasco came into the jail, came upstairs to the cell where I was being held and started shouting and screaming at me. Inmates in the jail helped me to understand it was just extortion, plain, simple extortion. He wanted £1 million pesos, about £25,000 in English, and he would give me a letter. This letter was legal in the Philippines. It meant that the case would just finish. I pay him, I go out. But I wouldn't. I wasn't going to pay even 1 centavo because I hadn't done it. He actually came back 4 or 5 times, always demanding money, always threatening. And I'd got my own daughter back home in England, and there's no way, having been accused of saying I wasn't going to prove that I was innocent.
It was quite horrifying, really, and I actually went to go out down the town one day, and there on the foyer was a untold amount of newspapers just splattered on the floor, and on the front page was like, ex-cabbie arrested for this, anything else. It didn't ever occur to me that my dad had done it. I mean, he got custody of me, I lived there, do you know what I mean? Like, all through the teenage years, when the girl was developing, nothing else. And I never had none of that problem, so I couldn't understand why someone could suddenly accuse him of doing something. I mean, the way he looked at Nika was his daughter. So in theory, why would he do it to one daughter if he had no intentions whatsoever of doing it to another?
Throughout all of it, I've been talking with the embassy, asking for their help. And they've been saying, don't worry, look, the whole family's supporting you. Tomorrow or the next day, this is going to be all over. Don't worry about it, just keep having faith in the attorneys, because the evidence, medical, witnesses, all shows that you're innocent. So this isn't going to last too long. I was there fighting for my life. And it just went on like that for 2 years, with promising tomorrow it'll be over. It was over on October the 9th, 1998, when the judge actually said, we're sentencing you to death.
Wherefore, accused Albert Ernest Wilson, alias Suny, alias Cano, is hereby sentenced to death. The
Well, Suny had already spent 2 years in prison whilst his case was heard. Now he faced 5 years on death row whilst his appeal was processed. In part 2, Suny shares the story of the horrors of death row. Welcome back. New Bilibid prison in Muntinlupa was filled with the Philippines' most hardened criminals. And they're not kept in cells, but allowed to roam free, dealing in drugs and sometimes murdering other prisoners. As Suny heard his sentence, he knew the ordeal he had to face.
When the judge actually gave the verdict and said, you're sentenced to death, everything just turned off for me. I just collapsed. Nothing worked anymore. I was like a computer and somebody pulled the plug out. The guards just got hold of one either side of me and tried to get me out of there. People were kicking and punching and shouting. It's just like a paid, organised riot with these 2 guards trying to fight their way out, carrying me like a dead body. Because that's what it was at that time. It was already a dead body. The embassy turned up and the attorney turned up. They were full of apologies. They were saying that they couldn't believe it was impossible and all this sort of thing, but none of it was any good to me. I was a convicted criminal. I was sentenced to death for something I hadn't done. I'd lost everything. Most of all was my fears about Vicky, because by now Vicky was also being charged. She'd also been charged with rape. So if I'd been convicted to death, what was going to happen to Vicky? She was out there somewhere, hiding in fear with her husband, going around with police with guns, with a license to kill her on sight. The same day the prison guards took me to Montelupa, which is the big prison rather than the jail, and there I stayed overnight in a place where they orientate you before being taken to death row. I know I was put into a small room, and I was the new boy, and the inmates in there wanted to try and get what money I had and everything, but the jailers that had actually transferred me from the jail to the prison had taken everything I'd got, so I got nothing. Next day I got transferred to death row itself, and there things really got hard. I'd come there and I wasn't in any fit state to make relationships or defend myself or anything. I hadn't got any visitors at all. The embassy weren't coming, the attorneys weren't coming. It was like I'd just been abandoned. I managed to get hold of some pills, and I was just thinking about, committing suicide, because I was on my own, and these people were all convicted of some crime whereby they were sentenced to death, and I was in among them. The worst time for me was after I was convicted. For 3 weeks I was on death row without a visitor. They left me on my own. I'd got no money. I got no food supplies, nothing. And the food, because of the small allowance that they have to buy it with, is so appalling. On death row, for me, there wasn't a day or a night. There was just periods of awake and periods of exhausted sleep. I was afraid, I was scared. People that I was in the dormitory with, one I was sleeping more or less alongside was a guy that needed drugs. He was volatile. You could never be sure what was going to happen next to him. Another one had hacked his wife to death. He was under mental health supervision. I've seen roommates suffer. And I constantly, 24 hours a day, had to concentrate merely on surviving, because survival itself was a 24-hour job. I knew I wasn't going to come out alive. It was all a case of I had to win though. I had to keep the letters going. I had to find a way to get a successful appeal, because I hadn't done anything. Moreover than that, Vicky hadn't done anything, and yet she'd put her life totally on the line for me. And I was so afraid that, she'd sacrificed her life for mine. Those first 3 weeks that I was in there were so horrific for me that I couldn't get my mind together. I was in Montelupa on death row with drug users. Some of them were being supplied by Pio Pasco. Any one of those could have stabbed me. And this guy is going around saying publicly that he wants me dead. And he's putting a price on the woman I love's head. So I didn't really ever expect to come out alive. I actually managed to survive because I built relationships. I decided to set out and on the one side write, like I've been doing in the jail, to outside organisations. On the other side to talk to inmates and try to help them a little bit with their cases. There's certain groups that I managed to write to. They're just people with hearts. People that were writing as friends, that were putting their feelings into postcards. Little postcards, just a few words saying, don't worry, we're behind you. Come on, keep in there fighting. These were the things that kept me going.
Suny geared people up back home and around the world to campaign to get him released. His daughter Denise even managed to go out to the Philippines.
When I saw my dad in the prison, to me it was really nerve-wracking, because I didn't know whether he'd want to see me. I wanted to see him, but I didn't know what kind of condition he was going to be in, what state of mind or anything. So kind of seeing him was going to basically make reality sink in. I found myself surrounded by people that were in there on death row for all sorts of crimes that I wouldn't have even dreamed about. He looked like an old man, and he hates me for saying it, but he did. He was unshaven, he was very skinny. I mean, if you can imagine, the person that I remember as my dad was a person that done handsprings in the middle of the road. And that was only like 2-3 years ago. So to suddenly see someone that didn't look capable of even sort of hopping along the road, it was a big shock. The fact that I always knew he was innocent, I knew in the theory that he'd be home, but I didn't know whether in the meantime, because it was such a long process, that he was going to get killed out there. I mean, when I left, I actually got a letter from my dad saying to me that 2 days after I'd visited, somebody was shot and killed exactly where I stood outside his cell.
One of Suny's main supporters was Ron Pegram from the League of Life, an organisation which writes to people on death row around the world.
I first became aware of Suny's situation through an article in the newspaper, and I decided there and then that the man needed help. I believed from that article that the man was totally innocent of the charges. And then, much to my surprise, I received a letter from him, and our association actually started from that first letter. There were times of great concern because in his letters you could sense the man was going through terrible depression because sometimes his letters didn't make any sense at all. And that's when he needed more help. And that's what we provided to keep his hopes alive.
I knew there was a lot of people on the outside campaigning for me, doing what they could. I was facing 4 years on death row before I'd know what happened to me. And then maybe I'd be finally convicted. Then it takes another 18 months before they execute you.
By now, Suny had spent a year on death row and had no reason to believe that the appeal process would treat him any more fairly than the original trial. Death by lethal injection on this chair would follow if the appeal failed. But for once Suny was lucky, the head of the Philippines Legal Service, the Solicitor General, intervened.
He actually said that the charges against me were total fabrication. And he is the head of the prosecution. So you can't really get a stronger recommendation than that. And by doing so, he actually speeded up my release. It must be, as far as I know anyway, the fastest decision on record. Before Christmas, an inmate comes into my cell in the dormitory and says, "Suny, you're acquitted." I couldn't believe it. All I could see was all the other inmates from my dormitory crowding into my cell. Not to congratulate me, but because I've been acquitted after a year and 3 months on death row. They've been in there for years. So seeing them all trying to crowd into my cell gave me that last fear. One of them among that lot is going to stab me. I couldn't get it out of my mind because I knew that Pio had drugs and drugs could get inside. And one of those was going to kill me. And now I was acquitted, I was going to die. I phoned up the embassy, and Alan Collins, who's the British ambassador, came down personally. Eventually, it was 10 o'clock, 2 hours later, when we found Vicky. And Vicky jumped straight into my arms. She was really happy, really over the moon. We went back to the ambassador's residence, and the ambassador's saying to me, "We're going to get you out of the country." And from what I've heard since, probably they were right to get us out so quickly. The ambassador actually carried our bags onto the plane. And he was there up until the second the plane took off.
I actually got a telephone call from a guy. He actually said to me, "Yes, it is true. Your daddy's coming home. I'm actually going to pick him up at 5 o'clock in the morning from the airport." And I was like, and it just, I don't know, everything just sort of come out of me. I just felt really weak, really empty, and it just, yes, it sunk in, but it wasn't like a reality sort of thing. And I was like, "Well, I'm coming with you." And then we got the worst fear of my life. We got a message over the tannoy. All the persons coming to collect the people from the Philippines, please come to information. That was it. I froze. I started panicking. But fortunately for me and everyone around, it turned out that there was a lot of press trying to hassle my dad. My dad wanted the security guards to sort of rush him through so he didn't have that attention and he could get away safe.
All I got in my mind, to be honest, at the time, was not greeting them or meeting them, but getting out of the airport, getting away. I wanted to be somewhere away from people. I'd still got that fear of people around me. I was looking over my shoulder, looking in all directions. It's something I can't lose. Even now I can't lose it. And finally I managed to get a few hours with them in my own house on Christmas Day. Just a few hours, but it was a tremendous thing to me. You know, it was the first time that I felt that I was not free exactly, but with those that I loved, in a place whereby I didn't have to look over my shoulder, that I didn't have to wait for that knife. So I was able to play with the kids that I hadn't seen. I was able to just sort of relax, just laugh, just smile, just release the tension that now is holding me so tight even while I talk about it. It was the one time that just for a couple of hours I could let go, and I hadn't been able to let go for all those years.
Oh, it was tremendous. I mean, especially at Christmas. Like I said, I wanted it for Christmas, but I didn't expect it. So the fact that he was like, bang, he was there in the house on Christmas Day. The kids were over the moon. I was over the moon. That my dad was safe, sound, and in England.
I'm no longer in the prison, but I'm still in prison. I can't forget the guys that are there. It never seems to be over. I wake up in the middle of the night. It's on my mind. I find myself unable to concentrate during the day. All the time it's playing there. It'll never go away. It's like, well, when I sign anything, I sign it dead man alive, because although I'm in one way alive, part of me died. And sometimes it just becomes very hard just to cope with normal things in life.
Suny Wilson, from death row to campaigner for justice for others. Even after his return to England, Pio Pasco's revenge has continued. Suny and Vicky's home in Manila has been trashed, and Vicky's mother has been intimidated and lives in fear of her life. On next week's programme, an incredible story of survival. British nurse Penny Roberts tells of her fight for life when her parachute failed to open 15,000 feet above Florida. See you next Tuesday at 8.
And that'll be at the same time next Tuesday. And we've another true life story that caused quite a bit of a stir after the break. Details follow.